In the humid, cobblestone streets of modern-day New Orleans, something was uncovered, something that had remained hidden beneath layers of earth for over a century. It wasn't a relic or a forgotten treasure but a chilling discovery that would unravel a forgotten, painful chapter of history. As the workers sifted through the soil near the French Quarter, they came upon something strange, a collection of small, worn objects buried deep beneath what appeared to be the remnants of a long-abandoned slave quarter. At first, it seemed to be little more than a common archaeological find. But as the workers uncovered more items, something unsettling began to take shape. Dozens of objects, almost identical in nature, began to surface. They were not the usual everyday tools or broken household items one might expect from an old site. They were strange, intricately carved figurines and trinkets, unmistakably crafted, each with intricate designs that seemed almost deliberate. These objects were eerily identical, like pieces of a forgotten puzzle, buried with purpose. The workers, typically immune to the oddities of their trade, grew uneasy. What began as a simple excavation of the grounds for a construction project soon spiraled into something far more complex. Each piece uncovered was not just an object, but a clue to something far larger, far darker, and far older than anything anyone in New Orleans was ready to confront. The items, though small and seemingly innocuous, carried an undeniable weight, an emotional and spiritual resonance that felt almost otherworldly. For many, the discovery was a sign. For others, it was just the beginning of a chilling mystery that would span centuries, intertwining the fates of the city's past and present in a way no one could have predicted. The discovery was unsettling enough on its own, but what truly haunted the workers was the realization that each of these objects was buried beneath what had once been a place of unimaginable suffering. The remnants of the old slave quarters were still visible in the excavation site, faint outlines of walls and rotting beams that had once housed those forcibly brought to this land. These were people whose names and stories had long been forgotten by most of the world, their suffering buried just as deeply as the objects they left behind. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed their memories, hiding away pieces of their lives and stories for reasons no one could understand. The workers, standing on this forgotten patch of earth, couldn't help but feel as though they were trespassing on something sacred, something that belonged to another time, a time they could never truly comprehend. But the mystery didn't stop with the objects themselves. No, the deeper the workers dug, the more they realized that they were dealing with something much more complicated. These objects weren't just relics of the past. They were something more significant, and something far more disturbing. As the excavation unfolded, rumors began to spread among the locals. Whispers about the site reached every corner of the city, stories about the strange objects that had been buried alongside the slaves, and the eerie power they seemed to possess. Old-timers recalled tales passed down through generations of New Orleans families, stories of strange occurrences and supernatural happenings that were somehow tied to the land itself. The more the locals spoke of it, the more the mystery seemed to grow. What was it about this site that had remained hidden for so long? Some claimed that the objects were nothing more than relics of a bygone era, artifacts left behind by the enslaved individuals who had once lived there. But there were others who believed something far darker was at play. There were those who insisted that the objects weren't just offerings or trinkets, but something meant to ward off malevolent forces, spiritual barriers designed to protect the souls of the dead from being claimed by evil spirits. Some even whispered that the land itself had been cursed, that those who were buried here were not allowed to rest peacefully. No one could say for certain, but the more people learned about the objects, the more it became clear that there was something unexplainable, something deeply supernatural, at work. The story was just beginning to take shape, and already it seemed as though it would change everything. The team of archaeologists and historians who were called in to investigate the site were just as perplexed as the locals. While they couldn't deny the strange nature of the discovery, they were determined to apply a more rational lens to the situation. They examined the objects, cataloging each piece, attempting to understand their origin and significance. Some of the items, they noted, appeared to be of African origin, suggesting a connection to the African slaves who had lived and worked on the land. Others seemed to be of more European design, possibly reflecting the cultural exchange between the French, Spanish, and African slaves that had defined much of New Orleans' history. But no matter how much they studied, no one could explain why these objects had been buried in such a manner or why they appeared to be so uniformly identical. It wasn't long before the story of the discovery began to gain traction outside of the city. News outlets from across the country sent reporters to New Orleans to cover the strange find. The mystery of the buried objects became a topic of national conversation, with scholars, historians, and curious minds all wondering the same thing: what were these objects, and why had they been buried in such a manner? The questions quickly piled up. Were they simply relics of an old, forgotten era? Or was there something more to them? The people of New Orleans, some with a deep belief in the supernatural and others steeped in skepticism, would soon find themselves divided over the true meaning of the discovery. The city itself, however, remained quiet on the issue. The authorities were reluctant to get involved, and many of the city's most prominent leaders preferred to keep the findings under wraps. It was as though there was an unspoken agreement to let the mystery fade into the background, to let the past remain buried where it belonged. After all, what could a handful of strange objects buried under the earth really mean? Wasn't it better to focus on the present, to move on from the past and leave these unsettling reminders behind? But the truth of the matter was that the buried objects weren't just artifacts, they were the key to unlocking something much deeper, something that no one in New Orleans was prepared to confront. The earth had kept its secrets hidden for so long, but now that they were uncovered, they seemed to demand attention. The story had only just begun, but it was already clear that whatever force had buried these objects under the soil so long ago was still present, still waiting to be understood. And as the excavation continued, the unsettling feeling that something far darker was at play began to grow. The deeper the workers dug, the more they uncovered, not just objects, but pieces of a mystery that would forever haunt the streets of New Orleans. The chilling discovery of the objects buried beneath the old slave quarters was more than just a forgotten relic of history, it was a sign. The land had memories, memories that stretched far beyond the reach of human understanding. And now, with the past being dragged into the present, those memories were about to come alive. New Orleans, a city steeped in mystery and haunted by its history, was about to be faced with a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. New Orleans, a city rich with culture, music, and an almost tangible aura of mystery, stands as a living testament to both its beauty and its haunting past. Situated along the banks of the Mississippi River, its foundations were built by the hands of those whose stories have often been lost to history. The city's legacy is one of complexity, shaped by a myriad of cultures and peoples over centuries. But beneath the jazz-filled nights and the festive celebrations, there lies a much darker, more unsettling history, a history shaped by the forced labor of African slaves, whose labor and suffering were the backbone of New Orleans' early growth. The story of New Orleans begins in the early 18th century when French colonists first arrived on the banks of the Mississippi. Founded in 1718 by the French explorer Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, the settlement was intended to be a strategic trading post and port city. But what truly defined New Orleans was its diverse, multicultural nature. French, Spanish, African, and Native American populations all converged in the city, blending their customs, languages, and religious practices into a unique cultural tapestry that would become the heart of Louisiana. Yet, beneath this multicultural harmony was a grim reality, the reality of slavery. As the city grew, so did its need for labor. Sugarcane, tobacco, and indigo were the main agricultural exports of the region, and these crops were incredibly labor-intensive to grow and harvest. The European settlers, unable or unwilling to do the work themselves, turned to the transatlantic slave trade, which brought thousands of African men, women, and children to the shores of New Orleans. By the late 18th century, New Orleans had become a hub for the slave trade in the United States, and its population of enslaved people surged. The labor of these enslaved individuals built the city's infrastructure, from its stately homes to its winding streets, while their pain and suffering became woven into the very fabric of the land. These enslaved Africans brought with them their own traditions, beliefs, and customs. Many were from the Yoruba, Igbo, and Bantu tribes of West and Central Africa, and they carried with them their spiritual practices, passed down through generations. Voodoo, a syncretic religion combining African spiritual practices, Catholicism, and elements of indigenous American beliefs, began to take root in the city. The enslaved people found strength and solace in their faith, despite the brutal conditions they endured. They would often hold secret rituals, singing songs of resistance and performing dances under the cover of night, hoping that their prayers would one day free them from the shackles of slavery. The architectural legacy of this time remains in the French Quarter, where grand mansions stand as a stark contrast to the dilapidated, often overcrowded slave quarters that once lined the outskirts of the city. These slave quarters, which once housed dozens of enslaved individuals in cramped, unsanitary conditions, are a silent witness to the history of exploitation that underpinned the city's prosperity. Today, those same streets are lined with tourists, visiting New Orleans to enjoy its food, music, and history. But few are aware of the dark history that continues to haunt the city, buried beneath the streets and the grand buildings. The memories of those who were enslaved have been pushed to the edges of the city, much like the old slave quarters that once housed them. The discovery of the buried objects in the old slave quarter wasn't just an archaeological find, it was a revelation. A stark reminder that the past, no matter how much it is buried or forgotten, has a way of resurfacing. The site where these objects were uncovered was not just any old piece of land, it was one of the many locations where enslaved people were once forced to live and work. These forgotten spaces, once home to generations of enslaved Africans, were far from empty, they were filled with the collective memories, pain, and hope of those who had lived there. And now, it seemed, the land itself was revealing its secrets. As the city's history of slavery was uncovered, it became clear that this was a story that had long been ignored or suppressed. For centuries, the experiences of enslaved Africans in New Orleans had been relegated to the margins, their suffering and humanity erased from the historical narrative. Instead, the city celebrated its European heritage and its position as a cosmopolitan center of trade and culture, brushing aside the darker chapters of its past. The discovery of the objects, however, forced the people of New Orleans to confront the painful truths of their history, and the ghosts of the past that had never truly left. The racial and social dynamics of the city also played a role in shaping the narrative of slavery in New Orleans. Unlike other parts of the South, where slavery was often seen as a distant, brutal institution, New Orleans had a unique racial hierarchy that blurred the lines between free and enslaved people. Free people of color, many of whom were of African descent, lived in the city alongside enslaved individuals. This complex social structure led to a kind of uneasy coexistence, where the boundaries between enslaved and free were often fluid, and where the legal and social status of individuals could change depending on circumstances. Despite their relative freedom, however, free people of color still faced discrimination and oppression, and their lives were often governed by the same racial prejudices that defined the experiences of the enslaved. The presence of free people of color in New Orleans adds another layer of complexity to the history of the city. Some free people of color were able to accumulate wealth and even own property, but their status was always precarious. Many were involved in the trade of goods and services, while others played important roles in the cultural and spiritual life of the city. It was from these free people of color that much of New Orleans' voodoo tradition emerged, with individuals like Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen, becoming symbols of both resistance and resilience. The blending of African, Catholic, and indigenous beliefs created a spiritual and cultural legacy that would continue to define New Orleans long after slavery ended. As we explore the history of the enslaved people in New Orleans, we begin to understand the significance of the buried objects found in the old slave quarter. These objects were not just random artifacts left behind by individuals. They were part of a larger, more intricate system of spiritual practices and resistance. The objects, likely placed intentionally in the earth, were designed to serve as both physical and spiritual markers. They were symbols of protection, of remembrance, and perhaps even of rebellion. Each object, identical in its craftsmanship and design, hinted at something more, a collective effort to ensure that the spirits of the enslaved would not be forgotten, and that their stories would be passed down through generations. These objects, once uncovered, began to draw attention to a forgotten history, one that had been buried beneath the surface of New Orleans for far too long. They forced the city, and its people, to reckon with the truth of its past, to confront the painful legacies of slavery that had shaped not just the land, but the very soul of the city itself. New Orleans had always been a city of shadows, where the boundaries between life and death, between the living and the spirits, had always been thin. But now, those shadows were beginning to shift, as the past began to come to life in ways no one could have expected. As the discovery continued to unfold, it became clear that New Orleans was not simply a city built on the remnants of its past, it was a city defined by it. And as the layers of history began to peel away, revealing the hidden truths buried beneath, it was evident that the spirits of the past were still very much alive, waiting for their stories to be told. As the excavation continued near the site of the old slave quarters, a stark realization settled in: these were not just remnants of a bygone era, they were markers of a past that had been intentionally silenced, buried beneath the weight of time and memory. The old slave quarters, now little more than a faint outline in the earth, were part of a larger story, one of suffering, resistance, and survival. These were spaces that had once been filled with human beings, men and women whose names had been erased from the historical record. The earth, it seemed, held on to their stories, as if it had absorbed their pain and anguish, and was now beginning to release it. These slave quarters were located near the outskirts of the French Quarter, where the most affluent residents once lived, enjoying the luxuries of the city's wealth and prominence. In contrast, the enslaved individuals were confined to cramped, unsanitary spaces, far removed from the grandiose homes and lavish lifestyles of their oppressors. The quarters were constructed with little regard for the comfort or well-being of those who lived there. They were cold, dark, and often overcrowded, with minimal protection against the elements. Yet despite these harsh conditions, the enslaved found ways to endure, to create communities, and, perhaps most importantly, to hold on to their cultural and spiritual identities. The walls of these quarters, long since reduced to rubble, had once borne witness to the laughter and tears of those who called them home. Yet, as much as the land had absorbed their pain, it also absorbed their hopes. Within these walls, the enslaved had developed complex systems of resistance and resilience. Through oral traditions, songs, and spiritual practices, they passed down knowledge and power, preserving their humanity in the face of dehumanizing brutality. The discovery of the buried objects, though seemingly trivial at first, became a window into this hidden world, a world that, for centuries, had remained obscured by layers of history and silence. The objects uncovered in the excavation were not typical artifacts one would expect to find in a slave quarter. Most of the items were small, handcrafted figurines, each intricately designed with careful precision. These figurines, which ranged in size from a few inches to a foot tall, were made from a variety of materials: clay, wood, bone, and even animal teeth. What was immediately striking about these objects was their uniformity. Despite being made by different hands, each of the objects appeared to follow the same design, a repeating pattern that was unlike anything else the archaeologists had encountered. The figures were often carved with detailed faces and symbolic motifs, many of which seemed to hold spiritual or protective significance. Some resembled human figures, while others took on the form of animals or abstract shapes that could have held cultural or ritualistic importance. At first, the archaeologists and historians involved in the project struggled to make sense of the objects. Their initial reaction was one of confusion. Were these simply relics left behind by the enslaved as mementos, or was there something deeper at play? It became clear that these objects were not random. They were purposeful. But the question remained: what purpose did they serve? The team turned to experts in African diaspora studies, anthropologists, and even practitioners of voodoo in an attempt to understand the meaning behind the objects. What they discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. The objects were not just pieces of art or decoration, they were part of a larger spiritual system that had been brought to the region by the enslaved Africans. These figures, the experts explained, were likely tied to the belief systems of the enslaved people. Many of the symbols carved into the figurines were reminiscent of African religious practices, particularly those from the Yoruba and Congo traditions. These figures were not merely decorative, they were likely used as protective charms or as offerings to the spirits. It was believed that these figures could ward off evil, bring good fortune, or protect the souls of the dead. The discovery of these objects was not just an academic exercise. It was a revelation. It exposed the ways in which the enslaved had maintained their spiritual and cultural practices in the face of extreme oppression. They had been forced to give up their native languages, their homes, and their families, but they had not been able to take away their beliefs. The buried figurines were a testament to this spiritual resistance, a silent rebellion against the forces that sought to strip them of their identity. Even in the most dire circumstances, these individuals had found a way to assert their autonomy, to maintain their connection to the world they had been forcibly torn from. As the work progressed, it became clear that the objects had been deliberately buried in a ritualistic fashion. The objects were not scattered randomly throughout the site, they had been placed in specific locations, often arranged in a way that suggested they were part of a larger pattern or ceremony. This was not a coincidence. The act of burial itself was significant. In many African spiritual traditions, burial rituals were not simply a means of laying the dead to rest, they were also a way to honor the ancestors, to ensure that their spirits were protected, and to maintain a connection to the past. The burial of these objects beneath the soil of the slave quarters was an act of remembrance, a way of preserving the spirits of the dead and ensuring that their legacy would not be forgotten. The more the team unearthed, the more they realized that this was no ordinary find. The buried objects were not just remnants of everyday life, they were part of a hidden history, one that had been deliberately concealed beneath layers of earth and time. Each figurine, each trinket, held a story, an untold chapter of New Orleans' past. These stories had been silenced by the ravages of time, by the deliberate erasure of the enslaved people's history, but now, with the unearthing of these objects, those stories were beginning to resurface. The discovery of the buried objects also led to a re-evaluation of the slave quarters themselves. For decades, these quarters had been dismissed as nothing more than a forgotten and irrelevant part of New Orleans history. They were sites of suffering and pain, of human beings reduced to mere property, and as such, they had been relegated to the margins of the city's narrative. But now, with the excavation in full swing, it was becoming clear that these sites were much more than simple backdrops to the horrors of slavery. They were, in fact, sacred spaces, sites of resistance, resilience, and survival. The quarters, long abandoned and forgotten, had been the heart of a vibrant and complex community, one that had struggled to preserve its culture and beliefs in the face of overwhelming odds. As the team uncovered more objects, the sense of the site's significance grew. The slave quarters were not just places where enslaved people lived and worked. They were spaces where lives were lived in defiance, where cultures were preserved despite the relentless pressure to erase them. The buried figurines were symbols of this defiance, tangible reminders of the strength and spirit of those who had endured unimaginable hardship. The more the team learned about these objects, the more they realized that their discovery was not just a matter of academic interest, it was a moral reckoning. For too long, the history of the enslaved people in New Orleans had been hidden from view, obscured by the myths and legends of the city's more glamorous past. But now, the buried objects were forcing the city, and its people, to confront the truth of its history. These objects were not just relics, they were evidence of a deep and enduring struggle for identity and survival. The land itself, it seemed, was calling out for recognition, for remembrance. And in digging up these objects, the city was finally being forced to listen. This discovery was more than just a historical revelation, it was a wake-up call. The buried objects were demanding that the people of New Orleans reckon with the past, with the painful history of slavery and the ways in which that history continues to haunt the city to this day. The forgotten quarters, once dismissed as irrelevant and insignificant, were now revealed to be a powerful symbol of resistance. And in bringing these objects to light, the truth of New Orleans' past was no longer something that could be ignored or overlooked. As the excavation site continued to reveal its secrets, something began to shift in the atmosphere around it. What had started as a typical historical excavation, focused on uncovering the remnants of a bygone era, soon became something far more unsettling. The initial discovery of the figurines and trinkets buried beneath the old slave quarters was, at first, perceived as an interesting but somewhat ordinary find. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians had seen similar objects in other excavations, fragments of tools, broken pottery, personal items from lives long forgotten. But these objects were different. They were too uniform, too deliberate. There was a consistency in their design, a repeating pattern that felt unnerving, almost as if they were meant to serve a singular, unified purpose. And with every layer of earth removed, the mystery deepened. The most striking feature of these objects was their uniformity. No matter the material, clay, wood, bone, or metal, each object bore the same distinct characteristics. Small figurines, often no larger than a child's hand, were intricately carved with symmetrical faces, detailed features, and markings that suggested more than mere decoration. They were purposeful, crafted with care, but also with a precision that felt beyond the typical use of such items. They seemed to have been deliberately fashioned to convey something, a message perhaps, or a story. The repetition of their form hinted at a ritualistic nature. It was as though a single, collective decision had been made to create these objects in such a way, binding them together in both design and intent. This realization was not lost on the experts who had been called to investigate. As the objects were uncovered, a sense of quiet unease settled over the team. There was something about these items, something that felt deeply intentional. It wasn't just their design, but the very act of burying them beneath the earth. It wasn't an accident, nor was it the work of one or two individuals acting in isolation. The objects had been placed in the ground deliberately, with a clear purpose in mind. And that purpose, however murky, seemed to connect them to the larger narrative of the land and the people who had lived and suffered upon it. The more the team analyzed the objects, the clearer the pattern became. Each figurine seemed to embody a specific element of African spiritual traditions, particularly those that had been brought to the region by enslaved people. Some of the objects resembled figures of deities, spirits, or ancestors, powerful symbols meant to offer protection, guidance, or strength to those who had been forced to work and live under such oppressive conditions. Others appeared to be more abstract, perhaps representing the forces of nature or the connection between the living and the dead. What was becoming increasingly clear was that these were not just trinkets or souvenirs. They were spiritual markers, placed in the earth as a form of communication with the unseen world, a world of ancestors, spirits, and forces beyond human comprehension. The consistent appearance of these objects suggested that they were part of a larger ritual or practice, something deeply woven into the everyday lives of the enslaved community. These objects were not mere artifacts of personal significance, they were part of a shared belief system, a spiritual network that transcended individual lives. The burial of these figurines, placed in specific locations beneath the old quarters, suggested that they had been used in some kind of communal practice, a collective act of remembrance and resistance. As the team delved deeper into the excavation, a broader theory began to take shape. Could these objects have been part of a larger protective or spiritual ritual? Some scholars began to propose that they might have been offerings, perhaps to the spirits of the dead or to gods and ancestors worshipped by the enslaved. The burial of these figurines could have been an attempt to protect the souls of those who had passed, to offer them a safeguard against the vengeful forces that often plagued those who died under such brutal and unjust circumstances. The repeated design of the figures, some resembling human shapes, others abstract forms, indicated a shared understanding of a spiritual system, a kind of coded language among the enslaved. These objects, it seemed, were part of a secret communication, passed down from one generation to the next, ensuring that the voices of the dead and the living remained connected. The team's initial skepticism began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of awe and respect for the object's significance. The fact that these figurines had been buried beneath the earth for so long, hidden from view, made their discovery all the more poignant. For centuries, these objects had been preserved, waiting patiently to tell their story. And now, with their unveiling, they were forcing the world to confront a history that had been ignored, suppressed, and forgotten. What began as a routine dig had transformed into a spiritual and cultural reckoning. Local residents, especially older members of the community, began to take notice of the excavation. Whispers spread through New Orleans, reaching even the most reclusive corners of the city. Many of the local inhabitants had heard stories of strange occurrences near the old slave quarters. Some had even claimed to see shadows or figures lingering near the area late at night. While these stories had been written off as superstition or folklore, they suddenly took on a new significance in light of the discoveries being made. Could it be that the objects found beneath the ground were tied to these old legends? Were the spirits of the enslaved still lingering in the area, or was something more malevolent at play? It wasn't long before these stories reached the media, where they caught the attention of historians, archaeologists, and even practitioners of voodoo. The supernatural theories about the objects began to surface, adding another layer of intrigue to an already mysterious find. Some suggested that the objects were placed intentionally to appease spirits or protect the souls of the dead. Others believed that they were linked to the voodoo practices that had deep roots in New Orleans, where spirits were honored and rituals performed to ensure protection from evil forces. The objects, with their intricate carvings and symmetrical designs, seemed to echo the symbolic language of voodoo, an ancient belief system that intertwined spiritual power with everyday life. For many of the locals, however, the buried figurines were a reminder of something far darker. Slavery in New Orleans had been brutal, and the enslaved were often treated as little more than property. The fact that these objects were being unearthed in such a way, a deliberate act of remembrance and protection, struck a chord with many. It was as though the past was refusing to be forgotten. The buried figurines, like the spirits of those who had suffered, were demanding to be acknowledged. They could not, and would not, remain buried any longer. As the excavation continued, the team was faced with a growing dilemma. They had uncovered a rich, complex spiritual world, one that defied easy categorization. The objects, each with its own unique design, suggested a shared belief system among the enslaved, but the true nature of that belief system was still unclear. Was it purely spiritual, or was it a form of resistance? Were these objects meant to empower the enslaved to resist their oppressors, or were they simply a means of coping with their suffering? Were they part of a broader cultural memory, passed down from generation to generation? Each question led to more questions, and the mystery surrounding the objects grew with each new discovery. The more the team uncovered, the more it seemed as though these buried relics were part of something much larger than a simple burial ritual. They were artifacts of resistance, markers of survival, and symbols of hope in a world defined by brutality. And as the team dug deeper into the past, they began to realize that the objects they were uncovering were not just relics, they were echoes of the lives of those who had once lived, loved, and struggled in the shadow of slavery. These were the signs, the signals, the symbols that had been left behind, waiting for the world to listen. As the discovery of the buried objects began to captivate the local community and attract national attention, something curious started to unfold. The once enthusiastic academic and historical interest began to give way to discomfort, unease, and, eventually, denial. The more the objects were analyzed and their cultural significance revealed, the more the people of New Orleans, and beyond, seemed unwilling to confront the deeper implications of what was being unearthed. As the excavations progressed, the excitement surrounding the find quickly turned to a kind of cultural wariness. For many, the buried figurines were not just artifacts, they were symbols of something much darker and far more unsettling. The objects, it seemed, had begun to challenge the very narrative that New Orleans had spent centuries constructing. The city, with its proud French and Spanish heritage, had always been a place of celebration and hedonism, infamous for its jazz, its Mardi Gras celebrations, and its rich, vibrant food culture. But the uncovering of these objects began to stir up long-buried memories of the city's history of slavery and the African cultural traditions that had shaped so much of its identity. These objects, created and buried by the enslaved, were an undeniable reminder of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon those who had once worked and lived in the city's shadows. They also exposed the spiritual practices that had allowed the enslaved to maintain a sense of identity, autonomy, and hope in the face of unimaginable suffering. For some in New Orleans, this revelation was a threat to the image of the city they had long cultivated. The idea that these objects, buried beneath the ground for centuries, could represent something as complex and powerful as an African spiritual practice was unsettling. It wasn't just the fact of slavery that many wanted to forget, it was the very notion that a vibrant, spiritual resistance had existed in the form of voodoo, ancestor worship, and other African traditions. For years, these practices had been dismissed or vilified. They were often linked to superstition, mysticism, and dark forces that seemed foreign and threatening to the white, Catholic population. Voodoo had long been seen as something dangerous, something to be suppressed. And now, the public discovery of objects that could have been tied to these practices threatened to resurrect fears that had never truly died. In the early days of the excavation, the reactions from local authorities were mixed. While some welcomed the chance to delve deeper into the cultural and historical significance of the find, others sought to downplay its importance. Local leaders, many of whom were descendants of wealthy families that had benefited from the labor of enslaved people, were notably cautious. The last thing they wanted was for the public to begin reassessing the city's history through the lens of racial injustice, spiritual resistance, and cultural suppression. Many prominent figures in New Orleans, who had spent decades carefully curating the city's image as a thriving, multicultural mecca of European influence, were wary of how the discovery would reflect on their beloved city. They feared that highlighting the legacy of slavery and the African spiritual traditions connected to it would tarnish New Orleans' image, overshadowing its more glamorous, tourist-friendly history. But the more the objects were studied, the more their significance became clear. Historians, anthropologists, and even religious scholars began to piece together the story that these figurines told. What was emerging from the dirt was not just a forgotten relic of the past, it was a direct link to the spiritual lives of those who had endured oppression and violence. The symbols carved into the objects, abstract faces, animal motifs, and intricate markings, spoke of African traditions of ancestor worship, the veneration of spirits, and rituals meant to protect the living from the forces of evil. The very fact that these figurines had been deliberately buried beneath the ground suggested that they were part of a larger spiritual practice, one designed to safeguard the souls of the enslaved and to ensure that they would not be forgotten. Yet, this revelation was met with resistance by certain segments of the population. In the face of these findings, there was an effort to minimize their importance, to label them as mere superstition, or worse, to dismiss them entirely. Religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, were quick to distance themselves from the objects. They regarded them as symbols of heresy, relics of a primitive belief system that stood in direct opposition to the teachings of the Church. Catholicism had been a dominant force in shaping New Orleans, and its leaders viewed African spiritual practices, particularly voodoo, as a threat to the religious order they had worked so hard to maintain. For them, these practices were not only unholy, they were a dangerous challenge to the power of the Church and its influence over the population. The Catholic Church had long sought to suppress voodoo, seeing it as a challenge to their authority. Over the centuries, the Church had condemned the practice as pagan and heretical, associating it with witchcraft and black magic. The rise of voodoo in New Orleans had led to a number of attempts to stamp out the practice, including the criminalization of voodoo ceremonies and the persecution of practitioners. The Church's stance had been unwavering, and the discovery of these figurines, tied so closely to voodoo and African spiritual traditions, seemed like a dangerous reminder of a past they preferred to forget. The Church's efforts to suppress these beliefs were mirrored by the state's historical attempts to marginalize the African population, both enslaved and free. But despite these efforts to suppress the truth, the discovery continued to grow in significance. As more objects were unearthed, the voices of those who had lived and died in the slave quarters became impossible to ignore. The buried figurines, each one an expression of spiritual resistance, began to take on a power of their own. The more people in New Orleans learned about their true meaning, the more they began to question the sanitized history of the city. The objects had once been buried to protect the spirits of the dead and to ensure that the lives of the enslaved were not forgotten. Now, they had emerged from the earth as a challenge to the city's collective memory, a reminder that the past could never truly be erased. The whispers in the community began to grow louder, with some claiming that the buried objects were part of a larger curse, a spiritual reckoning that had come to New Orleans after centuries of neglect and suppression. The stories began to circulate that those who had been responsible for burying these objects had intended them as a form of protection, but also as a warning to the living. For the enslaved, it was an act of defiance, a way of ensuring that their stories and their spirits would endure, even after death. The idea that these objects had a purpose beyond just personal protection, that they were connected to something larger, something cosmic, fueled the belief that the spirits of the past were still present, still watching, still waiting. This tension between denial and acknowledgement continued to simmer as the excavation progressed. The authorities, wary of the growing interest in the objects and the stories surrounding them, attempted to suppress the spread of information. Yet, despite their best efforts, the truth could not be contained. The buried objects had come to represent something far more powerful than the city had bargained for. They were not just relics, they were a symbol of the resilience of those who had been oppressed, a reminder that their spiritual practices, their resistance, and their memories had endured. The clash between the desire to preserve the image of New Orleans as a vibrant, multicultural city and the uncomfortable truth about its past created a tension that would not easily be resolved. As the excavation continued, the whispers of resistance, both spiritual and cultural, grew louder. The buried objects had forced the people of New Orleans to face a truth that could no longer be ignored. But would they acknowledge it, or would they continue to bury it, hoping that it would disappear once again beneath the surface? As the weeks passed, the excavation near the old slave quarters in New Orleans began to uncover more than just artifacts. It unearthed something far deeper, something that would leave an indelible mark on the psyche of both the local community and the nation at large. What had begun as an archaeological dig into the forgotten past had transformed into a cultural reckoning, a confrontation with the city's darkest history. The deeper the dig went, the more the past seemed to rise from the earth, casting shadows over those who sought to ignore it. It was as though the land itself, having absorbed centuries of pain, was finally demanding acknowledgement. And with each layer of soil removed, the psychological weight of this realization grew heavier, sinking deep into the collective consciousness of New Orleans. Initially, the psychological effects of the discovery were subtle. For the archaeologists and historians working on the site, the objects had sparked intrigue, curiosity, and an intellectual fascination with the complex spiritual practices of the enslaved. But as the objects became more widely known, and as their connection to the city's history of slavery and African spiritual resistance became clearer, the emotional and psychological impact began to ripple outward. Those who had long been content to view New Orleans as a city defined by its European heritage and festive culture were forced to confront the undercurrents of violence, exploitation, and cultural erasure that ran just beneath the surface. For some, the discovery was nothing short of a revelation. Older residents, particularly those with ancestral ties to the enslaved community, spoke of long-held family stories and whispered traditions that had been passed down through the generations. These objects were not just remnants of the past, they were part of the legacy of their ancestors, symbols of resistance and survival in a city that had long forgotten their struggle. For these individuals, the buried figurines held deep emotional significance. They were a connection to the past, a tangible link to the ancestors whose names had been lost but whose spirits had endured. But for others, the psychological impact was more unsettling. The public's growing awareness of the city's history of slavery brought with it a deep discomfort, even shame. Many residents of New Orleans, particularly those who were part of the city's wealthy white elite, began to feel a kind of collective guilt, a sense that they had been complicit in the exploitation of enslaved people, even if their own families had not directly benefited from it. This discomfort manifested in various ways. Some denied the significance of the find, attempting to downplay the objects as mere curiosities or products of superstition. Others reacted with anger, insisting that the city's history should not be re-examined so harshly, that the past should remain buried, forgotten, and untouched. Psychologists who studied the reactions to the discovery noted the ways in which the collective memory of a community could be shaped and distorted by its history. The tendency to bury uncomfortable truths, to suppress painful memories, is a common psychological defense mechanism. In the case of New Orleans, this mechanism had been in place for centuries. The city had constructed an identity based on its diversity, its music, its food, and its festivals, an identity that had obscured the painful realities of slavery and racial oppression. Now, with the unearthing of these objects, that identity was being challenged. The psychological weight of the past, which had long been kept at bay, had come crashing to the surface. The city, it seemed, was at a crossroads. On one side were those who sought to preserve the carefully curated image of New Orleans as a lively, multicultural hub, a place of celebration and indulgence. On the other were those who understood that the true history of the city could not be separated from the history of its enslaved population, whose labor and suffering had built the foundations of the city itself. The tension between these two perspectives began to fuel an emotional divide, one that extended far beyond the boundaries of the excavation site. For many, the psychological impact of the discovery was not just about confronting the past, it was about re-examining the present. The uncovering of these objects forced New Orleans to reckon with its legacy of racial inequality, its long history of discrimination, and the ways in which that legacy continued to shape the lives of African Americans in the city today. The buried objects were not just relics, they were a reminder that the scars of slavery had never truly healed. The psychological toll of centuries of oppression was still being felt, both in the memories of the descendants of the enslaved and in the everyday realities of those who continued to live with the legacy of that history. In the weeks following the excavation, local newspapers began to report on the growing psychological impact of the discovery. The coverage was often divided along racial lines, with African American writers and activists calling for a greater reckoning with the city's past, while some white residents expressed discomfort or outright hostility to the idea of revisiting slavery's legacy. The discourse in the public sphere grew increasingly polarized. What had begun as an academic exercise had now become a deeply emotional and contentious issue. The psychological toll also extended to the local religious community. For decades, the Catholic Church had been an institution of great power in New Orleans, deeply intertwined with the city's identity and its social fabric. The Church had long been a proponent of racial segregation, justifying the institution of slavery on religious grounds. Now, with the discovery of these objects tied to African spiritual practices, the Church was forced to confront its own role in perpetuating the racial hierarchy that had existed in the city. The psychological weight of this reckoning was not easily borne. The Church, which had long been complicit in suppressing African traditions and cultures, now had to grapple with the reality that those same traditions had not only survived, but had thrived, beneath the surface. For those who practiced voodoo or other African-derived spiritual traditions, the discovery of the figurines was a powerful affirmation of their beliefs. They saw the objects as symbols of strength, resilience, and survival, proof that their ancestors had fought back, in their own way, against the dehumanizing forces of slavery. For them, the excavation site had become a sacred ground, a place where the spirits of the past had not only been preserved but were now being acknowledged and honored. But for others, particularly those in the Catholic Church and the broader white community, the discovery represented a challenge to the established religious order. The idea that African spiritual practices that had long been marginalized and demonized, could have such power and significance was both unsettling and deeply threatening to those who had long held religious and cultural authority. The more the excavation team uncovered, the more the psychological divide deepened. The objects were no longer just artifacts, they were cultural and spiritual symbols, forces of resistance and reclamation that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. The excavation had become a battlefield, not just for the past but for the future of New Orleans' identity. Would the city confront its painful history, acknowledging the lives of those who had been enslaved and honoring their resistance? Or would it continue to cling to the more palatable narrative of multicultural celebration, ignoring the truth of the land upon which the city was built? As the dig continued, the weight of the past grew heavier, pressing down on everyone who came into contact with it. It was clear that the objects found in the slave quarters were more than just relics of a forgotten time, they were symbols of a struggle that had never truly ended. And as they continued to surface, they demanded that the people of New Orleans confront not only their history but their present, forcing them to reckon with the psychological scars that had been passed down through generations. The land, it seemed, had not forgotten. And neither had the people. The past was no longer buried beneath the surface, it was alive, demanding to be seen, to be acknowledged, and, most importantly, to be understood. As the discoveries from the old slave quarters in New Orleans continued to make waves, the growing mystery of the buried figurines and their significance began to draw the attention of a wide array of scholars, journalists, and even amateur theorists. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what the objects might represent, how they had ended up buried beneath the quarters, and what role they played in the lives of the enslaved individuals who had lived there. Theories began to emerge at a rapid pace, each one attempting to explain the apparent ritualistic nature of the objects. Yet, as the theories piled up, the questions only grew more complex, and the mystery deepened even further. What had these objects truly been meant to accomplish, and what did they reveal about the lives and spiritual practices of the enslaved in New Orleans? One of the most prevalent theories surrounding the figurines was that they had been placed deliberately as protective talismans. Many scholars, particularly those specializing in African American history and religion, speculated that the objects were part of a spiritual system aimed at warding off evil spirits and offering protection to the enslaved individuals who had worked in the nearby plantations. According to this theory, the figurines had been placed in specific locations around the slave quarters in the hope that they would serve as a shield against the various dangers faced by the enslaved, from the physical violence of their masters to the psychological torment of their captivity. In many African spiritual traditions, the concept of protective charms or amulets was central. It was believed that these objects could not only protect the body from harm but also the soul from being corrupted or lost. The repetitive and intricate designs on the figurines seemed to support this idea, with many scholars pointing out that the figures resembled those of African deities, ancestral spirits, or powerful forces from the spiritual world. This theory gained further traction when historians connected the discovery to voodoo, an African diaspora religion that had been practiced in New Orleans since the days of slavery. Voodoo, which was rooted in various West African traditions, emphasized the veneration of spirits, ancestors, and the forces of nature. The enslaved individuals in New Orleans, many of whom had come from different regions of West Africa, likely brought with them their own religious practices and beliefs, which were often fused with Catholicism over time, creating the syncretic faith that would later be known as voodoo. The figurines, with their symbolic markings and spiritual motifs, seemed to fit perfectly within the framework of this belief system. Some of the figures resembled the representations of Loa, the spirits worshipped in voodoo, and others appeared to be linked to African gods and goddesses associated with protection, fertility, and death. Another popular theory was that the objects were buried as a form of resistance, a way for the enslaved to assert their agency, even in the face of immense oppression. This theory was grounded in the belief that the figurines were not merely protective tools but also acts of spiritual defiance against the forces that sought to keep the enslaved people in subjugation. Many scholars noted that acts of spiritual resistance were a common form of protest for enslaved peoples throughout the Americas. In the face of an oppressive system that sought to strip them of their humanity, enslaved individuals often turned to their spiritual practices as a way of reclaiming some measure of control over their lives. By burying these objects, the enslaved were not just protecting themselves from harm, they were asserting their autonomy, preserving their cultural and spiritual identities, and defiantly maintaining their connection to the ancestral forces that had guided them for centuries. The burial of these figurines, then, could be seen as an act of rebellion, a way of asserting control over their environment and, symbolically, over their fate. As this theory gained traction, it prompted many to reconsider the nature of the slave quarters themselves. Rather than simply being spaces of suffering and deprivation, the quarters were now seen as sites of spiritual resistance and cultural preservation. The objects were not just mundane artifacts, they were part of a hidden spiritual world, a world that the enslaved had carefully cultivated in secret, away from the prying eyes of their masters. The quarters, then, were transformed from passive symbols of oppression into active sites of resistance, where the enslaved fought back against the horrors of their existence through the power of faith, ritual, and belief. Despite the growing evidence supporting the idea that the figurines were linked to spiritual and cultural practices, there were still some skeptics who dismissed the objects as nothing more than relics of superstition, meaningless trinkets left behind by the enslaved. These skeptics argued that the objects had likely been created for no greater purpose than personal comfort, meant to serve as small tokens of hope or distraction in a life defined by suffering. For them, the figurines were not symbols of resistance but rather simple expressions of the human need for something to hold on to, something to offer solace in a world devoid of meaning. The argument against the objects being part of a larger spiritual or cultural system was rooted in the belief that the enslaved people, deprived of their agency and their culture, would have had little capacity to engage in such intricate and deliberate rituals. Instead, the figurines were seen as personal artifacts, imbued with individual meaning but devoid of any grand, collective significance. One of the more controversial theories emerged from the world of the supernatural. Some believed that the figurines had been buried to attract or appease spirits, possibly even the restless souls of the enslaved who had died on the property. In this theory, the figurines were seen as part of an elaborate system designed to keep the spirits of the dead from causing harm to the living. According to those who believed in the spiritual power of these objects, the placement of the figurines beneath the earth was an attempt to either guide the souls of the deceased to the afterlife or to trap them in a sort of limbo, where they could do no harm. The intricate and symmetrical designs of the figurines were seen as key to their power, with each marking and symbol corresponding to a specific spiritual function or intent. Some even suggested that the figures could have been placed in specific arrangements to form protective boundaries around the slave quarters, creating a spiritual barrier that would prevent evil spirits or vengeful ghosts from entering. This supernatural explanation gained a certain amount of traction among local practitioners of voodoo and other African diasporic religions, who often held strong beliefs in the power of objects to influence the spirit world. For them, the figurines were not simply physical artifacts but powerful spiritual tools, capable of invoking protection, warding off harm, or guiding the souls of the dead to a peaceful resting place. This theory added another layer of complexity to the mystery, suggesting that the buried objects were not just practical tools of resistance but also part of a more profound, metaphysical system of belief. While these theories gained significant attention in the media and among academics, they also raised more questions than answers. The growing sense of mystery surrounding the figurines only deepened the intrigue. The very fact that these objects had remained buried for so long seemed to suggest that their significance had been hidden from view, either intentionally or because it was simply too difficult to understand. Were these figurines meant to protect, resist, or honor? Were they connected to a larger religious system, or were they isolated, personal talismans? As more and more theories were put forward, it became clear that the buried figurines had become a symbol of something much larger, something that transcended the individual objects themselves. They were markers of a collective struggle, a spiritual resistance that had remained hidden for centuries. Despite the variety of explanations, one thing became clear: the buried objects had power. Whether they were seen as protective charms, spiritual defiance, or supernatural tools, they were undeniably significant. And with every new theory, the mystery only deepened, as though the figurines themselves were guarding their secrets, unwilling to reveal the full story of the lives that had shaped them. As the community continued to grapple with these questions, the weight of the past, embodied in these small yet profound objects, loomed larger than ever before. As the excavation of the old slave quarters in New Orleans continued, something began to shift, not just in the public's perception of the buried figurines but in the very tone of the investigation itself. What had begun as an academic exercise to understand a piece of forgotten history had slowly transformed into a complex cultural and spiritual reckoning. Theories and speculations had begun to pile up, but with them came something darker and more unsettling, a creeping sense that there was a force at play in this mystery that could not be fully understood, let alone explained. The more that was uncovered, the more that was left to wonder, and as each new layer of earth was removed, it seemed that the past was not merely emerging from the soil, it was actively resisting any attempts to fully comprehend it. A strange and unexplainable tension began to grip the excavation team. What had started with careful, deliberate research now felt, for some, like an intrusion into a world that was not meant to be disturbed. The figurines, once thought to be simple relics of a bygone era, had become something far more profound, almost as if they were bound by an unspoken rule to remain shrouded in mystery. The more the objects were analyzed, the more inexplicable their presence seemed. In a way, they were becoming symbols of a larger truth, that some aspects of history, no matter how much we dig, may remain buried forever. The unanswered questions began to feel like an insurmountable wall, one that even the most rigorous scholarly investigation could not breach. This sense of frustration, of a mystery slipping further out of reach, began to take a psychological toll on those involved. It wasn't just the researchers who felt this weight. The local community, which had once been gripped by the thrill of discovery, began to experience a kind of collective exhaustion. The figurines, once a source of intrigue and fascination, had now taken on an almost oppressive significance. They were reminders of a history that could never be fully understood, a history that, despite all efforts to decode its symbols, seemed to reject any definitive explanation. The community began to feel isolated, not from the past, but from the present. The narrative of New Orleans, one that had been so carefully constructed over generations, began to feel fragile, even untrustworthy. The more people grappled with the mystery of the figurines, the more it became clear that this was not just about uncovering a forgotten story, it was about facing something larger, something uncomfortable. The buried objects had become a mirror, reflecting not just the past but the collective psyche of the people trying to interpret it. And that mirror, like the objects themselves, refused to offer clear answers. As the weeks turned into months, the excavation began to slow. What had started with so much promise now seemed to be unraveling. The team found themselves at a standstill, unable to make new discoveries or offer new explanations. The buried objects had been catalogued, analyzed, and theorized upon, but the deeper questions, about their meaning, their purpose, and their connection to the larger cultural and spiritual practices of the enslaved, remained as elusive as ever. It was as if the very act of excavation was violating some kind of sacred space, and the earth was pushing back. One by one, team members began to step away from the project, each citing different reasons, personal, professional, or intellectual. But beneath their individual justifications, there was an undercurrent of something more profound, the sense that they were dealing with something that was simply too big, too enigmatic, and too deeply rooted in mystery to be understood. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the excavation came to an abrupt halt. Despite the high-profile nature of the find, despite the intense media interest, and despite the promises of further research, the site was closed off, sealed away. The figurines, once the focal point of intense scrutiny, were locked away in storage, their mysteries left unresolved. The reasons for this sudden shift were murky at best. Some claimed that funding for the project had dried up. Others suggested that the growing pressure from local religious groups and community leaders had forced a pause in the work. But there were whispers in the community that something more than financial or political pressures were at play. It was as if the figurines, once unearthed, had begun to exert their own influence on the investigation, pushing those involved to the brink of mental and emotional exhaustion. Local residents, particularly those with ties to the African American community, were left with a sense of profound loss. What had begun as a moment of cultural pride, the discovery of a hidden, yet vital piece of their history, had ended in frustration, confusion, and disillusionment. The objects that had once seemed so full of meaning and potential had been locked away, their secrets hidden from the public once again. The closure of the site was seen by many as a betrayal, a refusal to fully confront the painful truths of the past. The community's collective memory seemed to be fading once again, as though the figurines had been swept under the rug of history, their significance forgotten in the face of other, more pressing concerns. But for some, the abrupt ending of the excavation only deepened the mystery. The sense of unfinished business, of a puzzle that would never be solved, began to haunt the minds of those who had followed the story. The objects, which had once seemed like mere relics, now felt like something more, something that had been left behind intentionally, with the hope that they would never be fully understood. It was as if the past itself had refused to be tamed, to be categorized, or to be explained. And in that refusal, there was an undeniable power. The figurines had become symbols not just of the enslaved individuals who had crafted them but of a larger struggle, one that extended beyond the walls of the slave quarters and into the very heart of New Orleans itself. In the months following the closure of the excavation, the figurines were largely forgotten by the wider public. But for a small group of researchers, historians, and spiritual practitioners, the unanswered questions continued to linger. For them, the figurines represented something more than just a relic of the past, they were a spiritual mystery, a challenge to the dominant narrative of the city's history. The objects had left behind not only physical traces but spiritual and emotional echoes, and these echoes refused to fade, no matter how much time passed. The closing of the excavation site marked the beginning of a quiet isolation for the buried objects. Their significance remained, but their presence was no longer tangible to the public. The mystery surrounding them would never fully vanish, but it would slowly drift into the background, becoming yet another unsolved chapter in the history of New Orleans. And in that silence, the objects seemed to wait, perhaps for another generation, perhaps for a different time, when the city might be ready to face the deeper truths of its past. The tension between those who sought to explain the objects and those who wished to forget them left a lasting imprint on the city. For some, the objects had come to symbolize the deep fractures in New Orleans' collective identity, the struggle to reconcile its vibrant, multicultural present with the haunting realities of its past. For others, they had become a symbol of resistance, of the refusal of the past to be forgotten, no matter how much effort was put into erasing it. And yet, despite the passing years, despite the fading of the initial public interest, the buried figurines remained. They had disappeared from the headlines, but their power lingered, quietly growing stronger in the background, waiting for the moment when the world would once again turn its gaze to the forgotten stories of New Orleans' enslaved past. Years passed after the abrupt end to the excavation, and the story of the buried figurines began to fade from public memory, quietly retreating into the shadows of New Orleans' rich tapestry of history. The figurines, once heralded as a significant find, were now locked away in storage, their true meaning still a mystery, their purpose still a subject of intense speculation. For some, the objects represented a fleeting chapter in the city's past, one that had been explored, examined, and ultimately forgotten. Yet, for those who had been closest to the excavation, those who had followed the story from its earliest days, the figurines had never truly left. They continued to resonate, quietly echoing through the lives of the people who had been touched by them. In the years following the closure of the excavation site, the sense of unfinished business hung over the community like a dense fog. Though the public had largely moved on, returning to the more palatable narratives of New Orleans' cultural vibrancy, the figurines remained a ghostly presence for those who had closely followed the events. For the African American community in particular, the buried objects were not just artifacts, they were powerful symbols of a forgotten history, a history that had been deliberately hidden and now, in its unearthing, was too complicated, too painful, to fully embrace. The discovery of these objects had unearthed more than just relics, it had unearthed the ghosts of a painful past, and those ghosts refused to be silenced. In the years after the excavation's collapse, a kind of silence descended upon the topic. The figurines became little more than a footnote in the city's larger history, a curiosity for scholars but little more. The local government, having initially supported the excavation, distanced itself from the project as the public interest waned. No new investigations were launched, no further funding was allocated, and the questions left in the wake of the discovery were largely ignored. The excitement that had once surrounded the objects dissipated, replaced by the everyday grind of life in New Orleans. But beneath the surface, the memory of what had been unearthed continued to linger, slowly but surely reshaping the collective consciousness. For many people, the objects were too unsettling to contemplate. They were reminders of a past filled with violence, trauma, and oppression, symbols of a history that many would rather forget. The idea that the enslaved people who had built the city had left behind powerful spiritual symbols in the form of the figurines challenged the prevailing narrative of New Orleans as a city of joyful celebration and hedonistic freedom. To confront the reality of slavery, to acknowledge the pain and suffering that had shaped the city, was too difficult for many. It was easier to ignore the buried objects, to let them remain locked away, relegated to a dusty archive, than to face the uncomfortable truths they represented. But this silence, while seemingly comforting to some, was not without consequence.